In June of 2020, President Donald Trump issued an executive order that listed religious freedom as a core imperative of national security, and also allotted $50 million to international development that was going to focus on the promotion of religious freedom around the world. This raises a number of interesting questions. Is international development important for foreign policy and for our national security? Is religious freedom important for international development? And if so, why? Also, how can the United States effectively promote international religious freedom through international development? Well, fortunately, recently I completed a study with the Family Research Council addressing all of these issues. And in this podcast, I'm going to summarize our findings. I'm Dr. Nolte, and this is Blind Politics. Welcome inside the podcast studio here at Blind Politics with Dr. Nolte. We are in Virginia Beach, Virginia at Regent University. I am Dr. A.J. Nolte, Assistant Professor of Government at the Robertson School of Government. I'm also chair of our International Development Program at the Robertson School of Government, which is a master's degree program. Please do check it out if you are interested in this episode. Remember that you can rate and subscribe on your favorite podcast provider. You can also find us on American One, your number one, that is American number one source for fine conservative streaming content. An up-and-coming provider, and we are so thrilled to be partnering with American One on this video podcast. Once again, views expressed in this podcast do not represent those of either Regent University or the Robertson School of Government. I am saying that, as I always do, even though RSG, along with the Family Research Council, co-released the study that I'm going to summarize today. And many students at the Robertson School of Government and in the College of Arts and Sciences were very helpful in that study. And I want to thank all of the students, any of you who are listening. I particularly want to give a shout out to some of our top performers in terms of research assistants there. Emily Polson, Daniel Harry, Hannah Waters, all of my coders. Thank you guys for that. And another big thank you and shout out to Arielle del Turco at the Family Research Council Center for International Religious Freedom, who was my co-lead on this project and helped at every step of the way from start to finish. So thanks guys for your efforts on this project. We are going to have a link to the study in the show notes. And so please do check it out. This episode is just kind of summarizing some of what we did. So, as I mentioned in the intro, there's this executive order that comes out in June of 2020. And it talks about the relationship between religious freedom and national security, and also advocates for a greater emphasis on religious freedom in international development. The link between religious freedom and international security has been substantiated elsewhere, but I'll just kind of lay that out for you here in this episode briefly. And it goes like this. Religious extremism, violent religious extremism in particular, is a driver of conflict around the world, from intrastate civil wars to terrorism to even great power competition. There's an element of violent religious extremism in terms of the Russian identity and the idea that Russia should have a sacred land ownership over Ukraine. Even there, you see elements of religion sort of playing a role in driving conflict. However, religious freedom tends to decrease violent religious extremism. Religious groups tend to become more extreme in an environment where they are not free. Absence of freedom leads to extremism, and that increase in extremism, in turn, leads to more crackdowns, and so it's this whole vicious cycle. If you can actually promote religious freedom, you de-escalate the cycle. You give people options to express their views without violence, and those views over time, while still remaining deeply committed to their faith, religious freedom leads to a decrease in that type of extremism. Okay, so that's the national security side. What about international development? Now, first I think it's worth pointing out and discussing the question of international development itself, because there certainly are people who would advocate that the United States shouldn't be involved in international development at all, that this is essentially a waste of taxpayer dollar. You'll often hear people saying, we're spending so much money on foreign aid that we should be spending that money at home. Now, if you were to ask people in polls, how much money should we spend on foreign aid? Democrats will tend to say 10%. 10% of the budget should be spent on foreign aid. Republicans want to cut the budget, right? Down to 5%. Republicans think, it should go, we spend way too much, it should go down to 5%. The actual amount of the budget in the United States that we spend on foreign aid is 0.5% of the federal budget. This is probably enough to pay for like Social Security for a week, maybe. Okay, that's the type of budget that we're talking about. I might be exaggerating slightly. It might be a month. The idea that we're going to save a bunch of money and fix our entitlements by getting rid of foreign aid is kind of like the idea that we're going to fix our entitlements by raising taxes on millionaires and billionaires. You could get rid of all of it and it would be a rounding error in terms of the amount of spending that we actually have on entitlements. The only way to fix entitlement spending is to fix entitlement spending. Okay, so the idea that we're going to have all this money for schools at home if we don't spend it on schools abroad is nonsense. It's just not, the math is nonsense. It doesn't add up. And people who are saying that are demagoguing the issue because they actually can't do math. I hate to be that harsh, but it's the reality. Okay, you're not going to fix the domestic budget for anything just by getting rid of foreign aid. The other reason that foreign aid is in our national interest, other than the fact that getting rid of it wouldn't really accomplish anything in terms of the domestic priorities people say they have, is that foreign assistance is way cheaper than war, right? If you can use foreign aid to raise people's standard of living and promote our values, which makes them then less likely to fight against the United States, and you've preempted a conflict that might spawn something that will spill over into other countries, something that can cause terrorism and so on and so forth, it is cheaper by far to do that through foreign aid, which solves the problem before it metastasizes into something dangerous, than it is to engage in the war on terror, for example, right? So it is actually very cost effective if that foreign aid is designed in such a way as to serve national interests, right? So it's not just doing good for the sake of doing good, although there's a moral case for that as well. There's a moral case for humanitarian foreign assistance as well. But it actually needs to be effective. It needs to be effective in raising standard of living, promoting human flourishing, and encouraging our values, because effectiveness is extremely important in terms of serving national interests, right? The purpose of foreign aid isn't to make ourselves feel good. It's because we believe that other people doing better is in our national interest. Other people having the chance to flourish, other people having governments that share our values and that live up to our norms and standards. We believe that if other people are better off, then they are less likely to be anti-American. They are more likely to buy into the international system as it exists, and that will be beneficial, right? If we're doing things that don't fall into those categories, then we probably shouldn't be doing those things, right? The goal is to promote human flourishing. The goal is to promote societies that are better off, and to promote values of respect for rule of law, respect for human rights, democracy, and so on. All right, and so that is the argument in a nutshell for why foreign aid in and of itself is in America's national interest, even from a very conservative perspective. I want conservatives to be more engaged in terms of foreign policy, because if you let the left in charge of it, they're going to spend a bunch of money on stuff that doesn't work. Why? Because look at what they do in domestic policy. They spend a bunch of money on stuff that doesn't work. And if that's bad in domestic policy, it's also bad in foreign aid. We don't want to get the reputation in America for being a bunch of do-gooders who spend money on stuff that doesn't work. We want to have a reputation for being able to go in, do things that are effective, that work, that actually make people's lives better. Because foreign aid that doesn't work is actually counterproductive. So I think it's important for those who are from a more conservative perspective to be engaged on that issue, because we want to do stuff that's actually going to be effective. Also, because I think conservatives have an innate understanding that you can't step on the values of traditional societies. And sometimes progressives just want to bulldoze those traditional societies, because if you get rid of their traditions and their traditional values, well, then they'll all be better off and we can all live in a utopia like San Francisco. I'm being a little bit polemical here, but not much, unfortunately, just based on the current state of international development and foreign aid. So what we find actually when you analyze humanitarian assistance, whether that's long-term or short-term, is that there is one group that stands out above all others in terms of providing effective aid that is both effective in terms of being sustainable and building things that last on the ground, and cost-effective in terms of not wasting money. And by far, in the foreign aid space, the best return on investment comes from faith-based organizations, not from the government. Government aid is simply not as effective as faith-based organizations. But FBOs, faith-based organizations, just don't have the capacity and the bandwidth that governments have, right? Because governments can draw it from 0.5% of their tax base and can still have a pot of money that is way bigger than anything you're going to get from faith-based organizations. And yes, even if you cut 0.5% off of everyone's tax bill and then said, go take that money and give it to faith-based organizations, it probably wouldn't make a difference, because not everyone's going to do that, and not everyone's going to allocate it to those same organizations. So charitable choice can be helpful, but probably the best way to do charitable choice from a foreign aid perspective is to bring FBOs more into the picture in terms of providing aid. Already, the United States government is mostly using contractors, and it's 80% of our foreign aid goes to, I think something like 10 international development contractors, right? That aid should be going to groups like Samaritan's Purse. Shout out to my former graduate assistant, Emily Polson, who's currently interning with them, who is also working on this study, and to other connections. Operation Blessing, shout out. Operation Blessing folks that I've had in class. Operation Blessing is co-located with CBN and not very far from us, and connected to us here at Regent University. And other great organizations, Catholic Charities, Lutheran World Relief, the Jewish Development Committee, Red Crescent, the Aga Khan Foundation, right? There's all these great faith-based organizations that are out there that are doing valuable development work, and so we need to be facilitating them doing that. You can start to see then how religious freedom might be related to international development. Very simply put, faith-based organizations are the most effective development actors. Religious freedom opens up the most space for faith-based actors to do their thing. So in areas where religious freedom exists, even in very poor countries, you're going to see a better rate of return in terms of development, because you have more faith-based actors on the ground actually doing stuff, and you're not restricting what they can do with religious regulations, okay? The more freedom and scope you give these organizations to operate in a developing country, the more they can do their thing, and their thing is much more effective than anybody else's. Okay, so that is the baseline, right? The baseline argument for why international religious freedom and international development go hand in hand. There are a couple of others. Religious freedom is positively correlated with economic development. It's positively correlated with innovation. There are very strong correlations that might be causal links between the presence of proselytizing religions. Protestant missionaries in particular was the area that the study was done on, but you could probably replicate that research with other proselytizing religions. Those religions tend to correlate with and are probably causal links to a number of things that are good for the promotion of democracy, things like literacy rate, the development of civil society organizations, etc. If nothing else, because the Protestants are producing a lot of books and a lot of periodicals, and then in areas where they're trying to proselytize, they're causing the existing religions to produce a lot of books and a lot of periodicals. Protestants are producing civil society organizations. In response to that, other religions are producing civil society organizations. So you can see how all of this lays out, and actually a scholar by the name of Robert Woodbury has mapped out a lot of this. Religious freedom actually positively correlates with women's rights. Many of our friends on the left like to argue that these things are opposed to one another, but globally that's not the case. The more widespread religious freedom is, the more empowerment there is for women, the more rights women have. the more educated women tend to be, because religious freedom is very positively correlated with education, and particularly with women's education, because a lot of those girls' schools are run by faith-based organizations. Okay, so all across the board, we're seeing very strong evidence that where religious freedom is present, it positively correlates and may in fact even be the cause of many positive outcomes for international development. So why is it that it's until June of 2020, there's no explicit mandate linking religious freedom to international development? And in fact, there's not really much of a policy architecture for how you should do this either. In our study, we not only did a literature review, reviewing a lot of the literature that we've just discussed. And again, this was a study I did in conjunction with the Center for International Religious Freedom at FRC. You can link to it in the show notes, hopefully, assuming that all the technical things work on that, which they should. But one of the things that we did beyond that was we interviewed a bunch of people who were working in the space, either religious freedom activists or government professionals, or international development activists or government professionals. We talked to folks in the NGO space and in the government space on both sides, and we asked them, why has this not happened, and how do we make this happen better? What worked well and what didn't work well from the Trump executive order of 2020? And essentially, how can we better connect these things? Right? So we weren't asking them, should this be connected? Because based on the literature that we reviewed, it was pretty evident that there should be a tie. We said, what's not working, what's keeping this from working, and how do we make this work better? And a couple of things stood out. Both in the literature and based on the people that we interviewed, we found that there was a substantial secular bias within aid organizations, and particularly within USAID. So for example, there was a very strong bias against religious organizations from government humanitarian organizations and from sort of large professional humanitarian NGOs. That bias is also chronicled within people who've studied international development, so we weren't particularly surprised to find it, but it was one of the most pervasive findings in terms of an obstruction. There was also a bit of regulatory capture within USAID because there were all of these big contractors that get most of the contracts. There's a little bit of sort of path dependency of we've always done it this way, so we always should do it this way. And there was a reluctance to bring in some of these new faith-based organizations. So you can see how those two things, right, the fact that there are 10 development organizations that get 80% of the contracts, and then also the fact that there's a secular bias in both the NGO space and the government space, those things would be mutually reinforcing. Part of the problem also was people in AID didn't really know what they were allowed to do. Several of the people that we interviewed who were working in that space were told by people in USAID that promoting religious freedom internationally was a violation of the Establishment Clause of the First Amendment. Now, in case you're wondering, the Establishment Clause of the First Amendment is meant to ensure religious freedom. It says the government can't prefer one religion over another. It doesn't actually say anything about the government promoting something as generic and non-sectarian as religious freedom. So the argument was that people were being told that they couldn't promote religious freedom because of the clause of the Constitution that guarantees religious freedom. That actually doesn't make any sense. Also, the Constitution doesn't apply in other countries. So there were constitutional bars that they saw. It was also seen as special pleading for Christians. This is partially because when Vice President Mike Pence, who was really a driving force behind this, he was instrumental in getting Sam Brownback appointed as International Religious Freedom Ambassador, and Brownback was exceptionally good in that role. And Vice President Pence was, in many ways, the point man within the administration for a lot of the religious freedom stuff that was going on. Credit also to Mike Pompeo at State. But he first mentioned this in the issue of helping Christians and Yazidis who were being persecuted in the Middle East by ISIS. And so, from that, people who were, assuming that Pence was a Christian theocrat in the first place assumed, oh, this is just special pleading for Christians. Never mind the fact the administration is also saying we need to help the Yazidis, we need to help the Rohingya who are Muslims that are being persecuted in Myanmar, and we need to help the Uyghurs who are Muslims that are being persecuted for their religion in China. Okay, so it's not Christian special pleading, but that was the perception that people had. A couple of other challenges. The UN, working with the UN, their development aim was just not very good on this. And there was no dedicated funding. So that money that was promised, that $50 million, $20 million of which was to be allocated for USAID, that $20 million had to be taken out of programs that already existed and that people had already funded for other priorities. So it was kind of an unfunded mandate in the sense that they were mandating this money be spent, but then they had to take it from other programs that they already had to do. Once a government program has funding attached to it, it has a certain amount of inertia. So even if people liked the idea of religious freedom, which based on the things that we've just discussed, they probably didn't, you're taking money away from their pet projects and their pet programs that they've been working on. And really that money probably had been allocated and they had plans for it, and you really are potentially harming other programs. So how do we fix this? There were a couple of best practices that were laid out. One suggestion was a dedicated funding stream, right? So have dedicated funding in the budget that is specifically for international religious freedom. Training was also seen as very important, and training that was going to be specific for USAID, specifically talking about religious freedom from international development. The general sense was that the training that exists in the State Department is pretty good through the Foreign Service Institute, but AID might need specific training on religious freedom, how faith-based organizations and international development, how that all fits together, and what they can and can't do. That training needs to include, based on the people that we spoke to, a healthy dose of information about the Establishment Clause and how it does not prevent you from promoting religious freedom or even working with faith-based organizations. The United States works with faith-based organizations domestically, where the Constitution is at its strongest in terms of prohibition. All the time on things like disaster relief and humanitarian assistance, we work with faith-based organizations. There are faith-based offices in every agency of the government that are helping faith-based organizations to work with local government and the federal government in a number of these policy areas. So clearly the government is allowed to do it because it's been doing it since the Bush administration without any kind of legal challenge whatsoever. Right, so that training component is very important. There needs to be oversight. That was an important role that Congress could play of providing oversight. So when these mandates are put down, make sure that they're actually being fulfilled. That was another really important best practice that was identified. And so, making sure that there is accountability, training, funding, those types of issues, and a real dedicated focus to them, right? Not privileging other things over them as well. I would encourage you to read the full report. I don't have time to go through every dimension of it. I think it's got a lot of really good data and is a really interesting and I would hope reasonably comprehensive. There's a lot more work to be done on this, so I'm looking at this as kind of like just the beginning of something. But I thought it was an important enough issue that I wanted to bring it to this audience. We tend not to think about foreign aid very much as an important policy issue. And international religious freedom, particularly under the current administration, has been pushed to the back burner. To get a little bit polemical for a moment here at the end, there's been a systematic de-emphasizing of religious freedom in favor of LGBTQ rights and pushing that internationally. And the reality is that you're just not going to get very far with that in a Muslim country. You're not going to get very far with that in a traditional Christian country. They're not going to be San Francisco tomorrow. And so that push has done more harm than good in foreign policy. And it's actually given an opening for our enemies, the Russians and China, our adversaries, are coming in and saying, we will give you the same development assistance as the United States, but we're not going to be pushing a gay agenda. That's what they're saying. And it has led to inroads by those countries in parts of the developing world. Religious freedom is different. Most of these societies are deeply religious. And if you put it in terms of the right to worship and to follow their own religion as they choose without being interfered with, you're going to get a lot further there. And people's ability to follow their conscience and opening up those rights will get a certain amount, not all the way, right? But is realistically probably as far as you're going to get on many of these human rights issues, including the LGBTQ issues, right? If you have an environment of religious freedom, you're certainly not going to be killing people for not conforming to your religious beliefs, right? We're eliminating that source of religious conflict. And that's probably about as far as you're going to get in a lot of these countries. So there needs to be a pragmatism and a realism with a lot of this. And unfortunately, that's not happening in this current administration. So it is an important issue to just discuss the positives and what can be accomplished. Because unfortunately, we've seen a turning away from that under this administration. And my hope is that under a more sympathetic Congress and hopefully a more sympathetic administration in the future, we can see some of the policies that came in, unfortunately, fairly late in the previous administration, brought in hopefully by congressional mandate, and then expanded upon by a new administration that hopefully has a better grasp on this in the future. All right, that's going to do it for this episode. Please remember to rate and subscribe on your favorite podcast provider. You can find us on all of the platforms mentioned at the beginning of this podcast, but please do check out the great offerings from American One, our partner in this video podcast project. And we're thrilled to be working with them, and we're thrilled to have their audience as well as our audience tuning in to watch and listen today. So that's a wrap. And for Blind Politics, this is Dr. Nolte signing off.